Just share her screen. Share for the PowerPoint.
So as Stephen mentioned, I'm the Director of Education at the Holocaust Memorial Miami Beach. Has anyone ever visited before? Oh, a few people, excellent. So I invite you to come visit us, especially next year. We are currently under construction, although we're still open, but we're building a new education center, which we're super excited about. And we would love to have you all come visit us. I know it's a bit of a trek, but I just took the Bright Line, and the Bright Line was super nice, although a little pricey. But we'd love to have you come see our new education center. So I did my PhD in modern European history. I wrote my dissertation on Jewish children in Poland after the Holocaust. And a lot of the research that I did involved also women's experiences and children's experiences in displaced persons camps, which is the topic of today's presentation. I really love this photo. So before we start, the photo is showing child survivors of the Holocaust with a young woman who is a relief worker in a displaced persons camp. And they're reading, and we'll talk more about all the efforts that were done in these camps to rebuild Jewish life after the war. How do I do this? Next slide, please. Okay, so I want us to think about liberation. So we're going to do a little reflective prompt exercise, not to place ourselves in anyone's shoes, because that's bad pedagogy when it comes to the Holocaust, but we want you to think critically and empathetically about the historical moment of liberation. So activities like this one, which we're about to do, help students move beyond dates and facts to consider the human needs, the emotions, the trauma, the resilience, core elements of Holocaust education, which I know you've been talking about over the last week. And you as educators can model this in age-appropriate ways for your students. So we have here, on April 4th, 1945, American soldiers liberated Ohrdruf, a subcamp of Buchenwald. After years of enduring starvation, forced labor, and the daily threat of death, survivors were emaciated, ill, and emotionally numb. The war in Europe was not officially over. Many survivors had no idea if any of their family members were alive or if they had a home to return to. So I want you all to think, what kinds of physical, emotional, or practical needs do you think survivors had in the immediately aftermath of liberation? What support systems would have been essential for helping people to begin to rebuild their lives? What do you all think? Yeah. Absolutely. And this was actually a big part, the Holocaust, it was a result of the Holocaust and the work with displaced persons and survivors. There were many different updates in human psychology and dealing with what then was not called PTSD, but now we have a word for it. One of the things that you were mentioning about trust issues, we actually have examples of this, of course, that took place in these displaced persons camps, and especially with children. We have stories of children who, when they were given food, there is a famous example. Speaking of Buchenwald, they're known as the Buchenwald Boys, and they were young boys, young men, survivors of Buchenwald. One of them was Elie Wiesel, and there is a very well-known story of the Buchenwald Boys. They were sent to a children's home in France after the war to rehabilitate and recuperate. And the relief workers have documents taking notes on how the boys are progressing. And at dinner time, they were given what they would consider stinky cheese, right? They're in France, so they're eating smelly cheese. And the boys refuse to eat it, not just because it smells and they think it's icky, but they think it smells because they think it's poisoned, because of their experiences in the camps, in hiding, in ghettos. And so this is just one example of that distrust that young children, if we're thinking about our students, our own children, it's hard not to make that comparison. What other emotional or physical needs? Yeah. Yeah.
You can't Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You can't begin to address your the top three tiers until you meet the bottom two, which is like food, safety, shelter, those things. And so, yes, the emotional aspect is so important. But if you have not known anything but 6 people to a bed with 1 blanket, you have to address those needs before you can even address the other needs.
That's a great point. And with the relief work, we see the first thing that they have to do, right, is food. Make sure they're malnourished. We know that there are stories, and I'll talk more about this later in the presentation, of immediately after liberation. Has anyone seen Band of Brothers? Band of Brothers, great miniseries on HBO, highly recommend it. I actually think their liberation episode, I think it's episode 9, is phenomenal. Very, very well done. If you don't want to watch the whole thing, watch that episode. I think it's a great teaching resource as well for older students. How they depict liberation is so well done. And there are scenes in that episode of the American GIs who come across the camp not having any idea of what this is, and then wanting to help, just wanting to help these people. They look skeletal. So what do these American GIs do in many of these cases? Without even thinking, they give them food, they give them chocolate, their rations, whatever they have, they give it to them. And then after these survivors being so underfed for so long, their bodies rejected, and so many survivors ended up dying immediately after liberation, after surviving years and years of suffering, because you have to be very careful, right, when you're that skinny, of how you kind of re-enter food into your system. Yeah.
I think one of the other needs that survivors had, Jewish survivors, is to be recognized as Jews in a way that was not pejorative. And a lot of the Allied soldiers didn't want to make that recognition because they didn't want to treat Jews differently, because they thought treating Jews differently was wrong. And in this particular case, they didn't realize that they needed that affirmation of their Judaism in a way that would help them to begin to reconstruct their lives.
That's excellent. That's a really good point. So thinking of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? So once you have food, shelter, you can start doing more kind of holistic, educational, religious, cultural rebuilding. And all of that happened in these displaced persons camps. We see huge revivals of Jewish life after the war in these DP camps, because as they say, in the camps, the survivors themselves, in Yiddish, Mir Zayin do, we are here. They want to assert themselves, their Jewishness. They survived. They are the so-called, as they say, the so-called surviving remnant of European Jewry. So they want to reinforce the fact that they are Jewish, and they are proud. Many were proud to be Zionists. Zionists meaning that they believe in the Jewish homeland, the Jewish state, then Palestine, now Israel. In 1948, it was established as the Jewish state of Israel. And so we see religious life revivals. We see youth Zionist movements for many reasons, because after what happened in the Holocaust, they want to have that protection of a Jewish state, a place where they feel safe, but also for many young people who had no relatives who survived, no family members, no friends, these Zionist youth movements in displaced persons camps, they became a way for them to have community. And so even if they really didn't believe in the Zionist cause, they were there because it gave them a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging. They were thinking about the future. And that's something that's really important that I want to stick with you guys, is that sense of thinking about the future after all the terrible things that happened over the last several years during the Holocaust. Thinking ahead to the future is really what kept so many of these survivors going. So, I don't know if this is working. Oh, yay, okay. So, as Stephen said, I'm the Director of Education at the Holocaust Memorial Miami Beach, so I'm very familiar with the state of Florida's Holocaust education standards. I'm just gonna put this here, just so we have it, if anyone has any questions about how today's presentation relates to the standards. We're going to describe the experience of Holocaust survivors following World War II, and think. Students will be able to do all of these things if you pick up just a few things from today's presentation. Also, feel free to stop me anytime and ask any questions. So today's presentation is really going to focus on women's experiences. So in the aftermath of the Holocaust, Jewish women played a critical, though often overlooked, role in rebuilding these shattered communities. They were survivors, but they were also wives, mothers, educators, nurses, relief workers, and they were leaders. As one scholar noted, they became, quote, transmitters of the past, caretakers of the present, and builders of the future. In this session, we'll begin by exploring the individual stories of 4 remarkable women. Right here we have Gerda Weissman-Klein. Some of you might be familiar with her. She is a very well-known survivor, and she wrote the book, what's it called? All About My Life. And it's a great resource, and she also has a short film about her life. I think it's actually like Academy Award winning. That's also a great resource. And then we have 3 other women we'll be focusing on: Margaret Hantman, Vida Kaufman, and Greta Fischer. All of these women's experiences illustrate the diverse ways women shaped life in displaced persons camps. And then in the second half, if we have time, if Stephen generously allows me to have a little time, depending on when lunch is, we'll dive into a document lab, and we'll use primary sources to get further insight into the post-war recovery, community organizing, and cultural renewal in displaced persons camps. So, I have to give a little historical background. As a historian trained at heart, I love maps. So let's talk about liberation. So we talked about a little bit about the needs after liberation, but let's get the historical context. So liberation took place slowly, starting in summer 1944. Look at this map here. What was the first camp liberated? I heard it. Majdanek. Majdanek in July 1944. So Majdanek was liberated by the Red Army in July 23rd, 1944. It was the first major camp, death camp, killing center that was liberated. And the troops were advancing so quickly that the Nazis didn't have a chance to destroy their evidence, destroy the sites that were still there to this very day. If anyone goes to visit Poland and goes and has an opportunity to visit Majdanek or Auschwitz, you will still see the remains of what is there. And so Majdanek was liberated in July 1944 by the Red Army, and then as the front continues to move westward, we then have Auschwitz liberated by the Red Army again in January 27th, 1945. That date might sound familiar to you because now it's known as International Holocaust Remembrance Day. And what I really want us to take away from this is that, well, 2 things. So 1, liberating the camps and saving Jewish people, stopping the Holocaust was not a priority of the Allied troops. It was just something that was going to happen if the war ended. That was kind of FDR's mentality. Another thing that I want you to take away is that the majority of the death camps, actually all of the death camps that were liberated, if they had any survivors there, which there were very, very little. I believe when Auschwitz was liberated, there was about 7,000 survivors who still managed to be alive. The Red Army saw the worst of the atrocities. And then in here, in Germany, we have camps such as Buchenwald, Flossenburg, Dachau. These were all liberated by the US and British troops. So while they did see atrocities, they also saw the survivors, but they didn't see the worst of the worst. So just keep that in mind when we talk about liberation. Yes. Yes.
It says it was held by Germany in this chapter. It's in that area where it says it was held by Germany. So was it liberated or?
It was liberated. Yes. Yes. So it's like right there. So right on the border. Any other questions? So we're going to watch a testimony of Gerda Weissman Klein, and we'll hear her describe her liberation. It's a very powerful clip. And she also, it's spliced in between her testimony and then also, spoiler alert, her husband's testimony. It's very, very powerful. So if you could press play, thank you.
Hey, Steven, I'm not sure for other people, but I can't hear anything on my end.
Yeah. Oh, yes. It's a great quote, isn't it? Transmitters of the past, caretakers of the present, and builders of the future. Right? It's very powerful. Yeah. All right. We're back.
Yeah, Steven, we still can't hear on our virtual end. Is there a link maybe to the video we could send?
Is the screen share, does it have sound share? On the, go ahead, just close out the share. Just, yeah, hit, yeah, stop share. And then share again. And then click on the right, and the right, on the right, so sound, share sound, far right, far right. And click on the optimize video clip, right underneath it. And then hit share. And then start.
My very clear view of freedom and liberation came that morning when I stood in this doorway of that abandoned factory and I saw a car coming down the hill. And the reality of that came when I saw the white star on its hood and not the swastika. And there were two men in that car. One jumped out.
I saw some skeletal figures trying to get some water from a hand pump, but over on the other side, leaning next to the against the wall next to the entrance of the building, I saw a girl standing, and I decided to go walk up to her.
I remember that aura of that awe, of the disbelief in daylight, to really see someone who fought for our freedom, for my ideals. And he looked like God to me.
And I asked her in German and in English whether she spoke either language, and she answered me in German.
And I knew what I had to say. And I said to him, we are Jewish, you know. For a very long time, at least to me it seemed very long, but he didn't answer me. And then his own voice betrayed his emotion. He was wearing dark glasses, I couldn't see his eyes. He said, so am I.
I asked about her companions.
He said, may I see the other ladies? A form of address we hadn't heard for 6 years. I told him most of the girls were inside, they were too ill to walk. And he said to me, won't you come with me? I didn't know what he meant. So he held the door open for me and let me precede him. And that was the moment of restoration, of humanity, of humaneness, of dignity, of freedom.
We went inside the factory. It was an indescribable scene. There were women scattered over the floor on scraps of straw, some of them quite obviously with a mark of death on their faces.
I took him to see my friends.
The girl who was my guide made sort of a sweeping gesture over this scene of devastation and said the following words: "Noble be man, merciful and good." And I could hardly believe that she was able to summon a poem by the German poet Goethe, which is called The Divine, at such a moment. And there was nothing that she could have said that would have underscored the grim irony of the situation better than what she did.
And this first young American of Liberation Day is now my husband. He opened not only the door for me, but the door to my life and my future.
I love that clip. Yeah, I think I was talking with Stephen before I arrived here. I heard it was a very heavy week, and so I'm hoping this presentation and this topic provides a little levity and a little hope for the dark subject matter that we're dealing with. But so, initial reactions to it, to the clip. Goosebumps. I know, I have goosebumps. I have another clip that I'm going to show later of another husband and wife duo that also gives me goosebumps. What other reactions? Yeah.
The English teacher in me is just tickled that the response would be a piece of poetry. So the level of destruction and dehumanization that occurred still did not remove the beauty of spoken word and how it is used in order to give hope and resilience. So that's choky for me.
I really recommend, if you haven't read it yet, read it yourself and also consider using it as a resource in your classes. But her memoir, All But My Life, is really well written. And there's also a short film version. Other reactions? Yeah.
So I think there are certain details that she mentions. Holding a conversation with someone that is willing to use more than one language in order for her to understand, and being able to hold a conversation with her. That's to me, holding a conversation with someone is a first acknowledgement of the humanity of the other. I'm sure she never had that coming from a Nazi guard, for example, who were always barking at her in German, probably, only. So that first part, the conversation, then holding the door for her and letting her go. Like these small actions that reflect something great, some kind of greatness, humaneness in that. I'm sure at the moment when she was looking at this soldier, she couldn't grasp that they were being liberated, that the war was ending. But the first guarantee that her humanity was coming back to her were these small actions. Yeah.
I just want to reinforce what you said. I think that the humanity, the dignity, and freedom, and I think that carries on into the displaced persons camps. Also, this freedom was a very big thing in the displaced persons camp concerning the Zionist movement. Also, it reinforced many of the survivors, as well as my mother, wanted to go to Israel. So there was, my dad wanted to go to the United States, there was a pull, but freedom and independence, mostly freedom was the most important thing for them. Yeah.
And you're a 2G. Oh my goodness. That's amazing. We'll leave time so we can hear. Did you already present? I forget. Or are you? Okay. I want to hear more about your story. We all need to hear more. So, speaking of freedom, how do we think Gerda's testimony challenges or complicates the narrative, this common narrative of liberation purely as joyful and triumphant? We might think, right, when they're liberated, these big buff American soldiers come and they just crash open the doors and you're free. You can do whatever you want now. What was the reality like?
Well, other than the romance, the thing that stuck out with me the most is the stark contrast, because here's two different Jewish people, and one of them has gone through this horrific experience solely because of where they were unfortunate enough to be born and at what time. And the other one is a soldier who's enjoying a good life. He's protected, he has status, his basic needs are met, he's safe. And so to me, that was a huge contrast. And I think that that's something that they might not have realized it because, you know, they're in the camps, they don't get news. I would have a lot of strange and conflicting emotions coming out of a camp and realizing that it was only happening in my part of the world and that Jews in the United States and other countries were okay. It would be hard for me to assimilate back into that country. And I think that's why you see so many of them immigrate to the United States or to Israel. Like it wasn't just that they didn't have a home to go back to, but they probably didn't trust that the people wouldn't do it again to them.
We'll talk more about that, but absolutely, that the distrust, the fear of anti-Semitism in Poland in particular. Survivors, after they're liberated, they try to go home just to see, not necessarily if they want to stay there long term. Some did, but others just wanted to see if any family members survived. So they went back to their homes, some of them in Poland, and they were met with violence. They were met with anti-Semitism. They were met with questions of, we have one survivor in Miami, Jack Waxel. He was a survivor who lived in Jedlinsk, Poland, and he said he went back after he was liberated, and his neighbors, who he said he had known for his entire life, he used to play soccer with them, they were friends. His Polish neighbor said, "What are you doing here? Why are you back? Didn't they kill all of you?" And this is like a common trope that you'll hear sometimes from survivors who return to Poland in particular. And Poland had several really nasty pogroms. Anyone know what a pogrom is? Yeah.
A pogrom is state-sponsored violence against Jews, mostly in Eastern Europe, Russia and Poland in particular.
Exactly. So Poland, the largest pogrom, the Kielce pogrom, really spurred mass immigration. Really, the majority of Jewish survivors who went back to Poland in 45, 46, after that Kielce pogrom, it was almost like a wake-up call, and they had to leave. So they went to displaced persons camps in Germany.
Very clear.
Next slide, please. So, liberation was bittersweet. So there was so many feelings and so many emotions for the survivors. There was confusion, bewilderment, as much as joy and relief. Reports from liberating forces, as well as testimony from survivors themselves, reveal passivity, apathy, profound sense of alienation, estrangement, hostility, social anxiety, loneliness, fear of the future. So in addition to physical health problems, many had infectious diseases, tuberculosis. Many survivors also suffered from impaired memory, inability to concentrate, restlessness, fits of rage, weeping for, quote, no apparent reason, emotional anxiety, and hypersensitivity. Would someone mind reading this quote for me?
Then came a loneliness that took over me sevenfold. I had already lived amongst Jews, but it seemed that each of us here is lonely within, a loneliness within a collective. At nights I would lay on the hard mattress, bundle up in blankets, but I couldn't sleep a wink. The thoughts came one after another. My past, father's house, my small town in which all Jewish life had ceased. I couldn't find any relief. What should I do now? After all, life must go on. I was searching for someone with whom I could share my feelings.
You said you're an English teacher? I can tell. I love how you read that. So powerful. Thoughts, responses to that quote? Yeah.
It's kind of like when you're having a really bad day and you call your best friend to vent, and you're not really looking for them to solve anything, you just want validation. So it's like people wanted to feel validated, and they wanted to feel that their experience not just mattered, but was shared. So you couldn't really talk about it with somebody who, as empathetic as they might be, wasn't there and didn't get it. So I guess that's why you saw so many survivors marry each other, you know?
Absolutely. There's kind of this misconception. People say that survivors didn't like to talk after the Holocaust. And yes, to a certain extent, that is true. When they came to the US and other countries, a lot of people didn't want to hear about their experiences. They wanted to move forward. But we know that in the immediate post-war years, survivors like Helen, as you were saying, they were talking amongst each other. They really just wanted to talk. A lot of them wanted to talk through what they went through. And where else could they find that solace and that kind of camaraderie was between each other.
I was just going to say that all of these feelings probably come from, they didn't have the time to process all those feelings at the time because they were so focused on survival. So afterwards, I can imagine that kind of hit like a tidal wave of all these feelings and stuff they'd never got a chance to process. So the weeping for no reason, like you mentioned, that probably comes from all those bottled up, they were focused on survival, they weren't focused on feeling.
I find that line, and that's a direct quote, weeping for no reason from a relief workers report. I read that and I was like, I think I know the reason. Like, there's a reason for them weeping. So the war officially ended in Europe, May 8th, 1945, known as VE, or Victory in Europe Day. But recovery wasn't easy. Much of Europe laid in ruins due to the war, due to Allied bombing. There was a complete lack of infrastructure. Cities were destroyed, roads were destroyed, and there was really little knowledge about people's whereabouts. So you were liberated and you wanted to find your family members. That knowledge couldn't be easily, right? You can't just call someone up or text them like we can now, where are you? It was a whole saga to try to find if there were any living family members in your community. Okay. So, as I had mentioned, after liberation, many survivors were either unable or unwilling to return to their homes in Eastern Europe due to hostility, anti-Semitism, violence, the pogroms that I had mentioned before. Those who did not return home those who did return home often feared for their lives. And so these homeless Holocaust survivors migrated west into the territories, into Allied occupied Germany, Austria, and Italy. And this is where the majority of displaced persons camps were. And when we say displaced persons, they're basically refugees, right? It's just a difference of word, a difference of, at that time, like legal status as well. But so between 1945 and 1952, so 7 years, there were approximately 250,000 Jewish DPs. And this number is an estimate. A lot of scholars have a hard time actually pinpointing this number. It might have been a little less, it might have been a little more. That's because there was so much movement at this time, and the borders changing as well. And so it's hard to get an exact number. So Between 1945 and 1947, these DP camps, displaced person camps, were initially run by Allied authorities and then the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. It's known for its acronym UNRRA, that's what scholars call it, not to be confused with the UNWA or UNRRA of today. Some might you be familiar, it's in the news, not connected to the Palestinian agency. So UNRRA. So in early July, June, July 1945, these displaced person camps were run solely by Allied authorities. So US troops, British troops, the French troops. They had camps in their zones. Germany, let me go back. Germany at the time after the war ended was divided into 4 zones: the Soviet zone, the US zone, the British zone, and the French zone. The Soviet zone in Eastern Europe did not technically have any displaced persons camps. They were in the other 3 in the kind of western side of Germany and south. So a lot were near Munich, and I'll show a map in a second. But so in June and July of 1945, these camps were run by Allied authorities, and the living conditions were terrible. They were essentially just, oh, no worries. A lot of them were like remodeled, barely remodeled, like concentration camps. Like one of the DP camps was Bergen-Belsen. And so imagining being liberated and then going back to the same horrible living conditions that you were already in. And so with that in mind, the US government sent Representative Earl Harrison to inspect and evaluate these displaced persons camps. And what he saw was horrific. And he wrote a report that was given to the president where he harshly criticized the conditions in these DP camps. He said, quote, "We appear to be treating the Jews as the Nazis treated them, except that we do not exterminate them." So that's how bad it was. So after this report was released in August 1945, it was a wake-up call. And so the Allied authorities began separating Jewish displaced persons in particular from other displaced persons. So displaced persons were not just Jewish, although the majority were Jewish displaced persons. There were also Polish non-Jewish displaced persons, Hungarian non-Jewish displaced persons. And can you think of a reason why Jewish DPs would want to be separated from these populations? They're still anti-Semitic. Yeah, they're still anti-Semitic. And then in some cases, they might have been collaborators, right? Like they might have been working alongside the Nazis and these soldiers during the Holocaust. So it's very triggering for them. Yeah. Okay.
I just wanted to tell everybody, in case you're interested, I posted a link in the articles section to the Harrison report.
Thank you so much.
You can read the Harrison report in its entirety.
Yeah, it's very, very revealing. And so UNRRA, as a result of this, the Allied forces are basically like, all right, this is like a bit too much for us to handle. We also still have like a war going on in the Pacific, and not yet over. So they were like, we need to like hand off this responsibility to someone else. So they give it to the UN, and they have UNRRA. So from 45, fall of 45 to the end of 47, these displaced person camps are run by UNRRA. And then in 48, it's replaced by the International Refugee Organization, or the IRO. And so this is a map that is pointing out the major DP camps. Where did you mention that you were born? And you said it was West Berlin. Okay, not on there, but there's Berlin. Some of the big ones, some of the big DP camps in the US zone down here are Feldafing and Florenwald. You might have heard of that. One that we'll be talking about later in the presentation is Kloster Indersdorf, and that was a children's center. And so you'll notice Bergen-Belsen, that's another one that was in the British zone. Down here, I should have had a map of it, is the American zone. And then I think what's interesting is that there were several displaced person camps in Italy. any educated guesses about why there might be DP camps in Italy? There's a few reasons why. Yeah. Yes, exactly. That's one of them. What else? Where in Italy, like the location of Italy geographically? We're thinking about the future. It's on the Mediterranean, exactly. So a lot of these displaced person camps in Italy were essentially transit camps. So they were trying to get to Palestine, later Israel in 48. So they would stop on their way to Palestine in these DP camps in Italy. So it was like a transit area for them. So I've already thrown some of these acronyms at you. I'm sure a lot of you who teach social studies know like FDR's New Deal's alphabet soup. This is also like an alphabet soup. So just for our own knowledge, so we're all working with the same words. DP, Displaced Persons. UNRRA, United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. UNRRA worked with other organizations on the ground. They needed a lot of help because it was a big, heavy lift. So they worked with organizations like the JDC. They're the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. You might also hear it referred to as the Joint. The Joint has been around since 1914, since the beginning of World War I, and actually is still working today. They're helping with the war in Ukraine. They're an amazing organization. Another organization that UNRRA worked with was ORT, Organization for Rehabilitation Through Training. And then I had mentioned UNRRA was replaced by the IRO, International Refugee Organization, in 1948. I also just want to point out this picture. I love this. He's so cute. He's standing in front of an UNRRA truck, and he's got his little like UNRRA military uniform on. I love it. Yes, HIAS. HIAS is also another big one. Thank you. HIAS was another big one. So HIAS, H-I-A-S, they helped with resettling DPs and refugees, mostly to the United States. I assume your family worked with HIAS. Yeah. IRC, yes, today, yes. So a lot of these have like continued history. So UNRRA, IRO then becomes what the UN Refugee Agency is today. So there's history there, it's all connected. Okay, so let's continue to talk more about happy things. So family played an important role in women establishing, really men and women, but the sake of this talk, women focus, in establishing their new lives. Having lost everything, their homes, their communities, their families, there was a sense of urgency for survivors to create their own families. There was a need for warmth, for intimacy. They felt like so much of their young lives had been lost to the horrors of the Holocaust. They urgently needed to start living now. And so we see DPs marrying each other. Sometimes they knew each other for a few days, a week, and they would get married. Many newlyweds barely knew each other at all. Some young women would marry men who were considerably older than themselves, and they're really known by some scholars as, quote, it's kind of cruel, but marriage is born out of desperation. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't love. I think for a lot of survivors, it turned into love over time. I like this quote here from a young man survivor. I was lonely, she was lonely, perhaps together we will be half as lonely. In the Bergen-Belsen camp, in the British zone, in 1 year alone, there was 1,070 marriages. At some points throughout that year, there were multiple marriages happening just in one day. And this is a photograph of a wedding happening in a DP camp. These survivors desperately yearned for a so-called normal family domestic life. And by deciding to marry, the survivors asserted their sense of obligation to the past. their desire to continue their family line, and continue their commitment to the Jewish tradition. Rabbis in displaced persons camps encouraged women in particular to conduct their family life in accordance with Jewish tradition and perpetrate the memory of their family members who had died during the Holocaust. So I have some kind of fun, unique artifacts in here. Some of you might have seen this before. This is a wedding dress that was made in a displaced persons camp, worn during one of these marriages. The survivor, Lily Lax Freeman, this is her wedding dress. She donated it to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in, I believe, 2018. And I think it's on display there now. It's made out of parachute material, fabric. Her fiance at the time, later husband, Ludwig, went and searched for this material to make her a dress. It was always her dream to be married in a white wedding dress, so he made it happen for her. And the seamstress in the displaced persons camp used the leftover material of this fabric to make her husband a nice shirt to wear for the wedding. After their wedding, 6 months later, Lily's sister wore it, and then her cousin, and then according to Lily, as many as 17 other brides wore it, but then she stopped counting. I love that. So Lily and her husband did eventually emigrate to the United States in 1948. I think these are really interesting. If you can't have the dress itself, I still think it's a nice resource to show students. I love clothing too, so. So what happens after marriage? Babies. So between 46 and 48, the birth rate in DP camps was the highest in the world. So after everything that they had gone through, this baby boom was really a direct response to the catastrophic losses of the Holocaust. According to one report from the JDC, the Joint, in the second half of 1946, 750 babies were born every month in DP camps, just in the US zone. And then they also said nearly 1/3 of Jewish women in the US zone between the ages of 18 and 43 either were expectant mothers or had just had a baby. So 1/3 of all women were either about to be moms or were already mothers. This is kind of a companion quote to the other quote from the young man about being lonely. All I wanted right away was a baby. This was the only hope for me. For women in particular, and I'm sure you talked about this in your last few sessions, talking about rape, sexual violence, infertility, there were very, very real concerns among women that they wouldn't be able to have children at all, given that either they didn't eat enough and so they lost their menstrual cycle, they had such low calories, such low body weight and body fat that they weren't able to have their periods, so they were worried that they were experiencing infertility. Other women were experimented on, and we know that that also happened in the camps, different experiments. And so for women to just get their periods, something that I think a lot of us and our students, our teenage students, might be like, oh, I hate getting my period. But for these women, it was a celebration every month, something that we don't look forward to, is just a fact of life. We might take for granted or dislike. But for these women, it was a sign of hope. It was a sign of a future. So I have some fun photos here that I want to show. So this is a pretty famous photo of 4 children that were born in one day at a displaced persons camp. Look at them, so cute. No. This is a nurse at a displaced persons camp weighing a baby, and then this photo is the celebration of the 1,000th birth in a displaced persons camp. So they're celebrating that baby right there. Yeah, of course.
My mother had a very hard birth. I mean, she was nutritionally deficient. I mean, she started eating. She was in pretty bad shape. But anyways, she almost died. But she did mention, she said, I was surrounded by German doctors, and they were all speaking German to me.
Imagine how triggering that must be.
Exactly.
Yeah, that is very interesting. I would recommend, if you want to learn more about this, I encourage you to read it as well. It's a really great book that came out several years ago called Jews, Germans, and Allies, Encounters in Occupied Germany by Atina Grossman. She talks about a lot of the gendered experiences in displaced persons camps. She talks about marriages, the baby boom, but one thing that she has an entire section on is what you're talking about. These German doctors, German nurses that were working in these centers and what those interactions were like. Very, very interesting. Thank you so much for sharing. Really tense, really tense. No trust, mistrust. Yeah. Yeah. We also know that there are instances where if some of the smaller displaced persons camps, if they got too full, they would then have basically spillover area in local homes where basically, and this was early on when the Allied troops were still administering these camps, they had a little bit more force behind them. They would go into local German homes and say, get out of your home, we're giving it to this Jewish family. So imagine those tense relationships there as well. Like one right doesn't make a wrong, or one wrong doesn't make a right. Yeah. Oh my God. Ugh. I love this. This is the best part of doing like these kind of presentations is I love hearing the family stories. It's so special. Okay, so this is another powerful testimony that I want to share. I mentioned it's a husband and wife duo. I will give a warning. There is mention of like self-harm and abortion. So it still has like an uplifting end, I think, but just as a heads up, it's a little bit heavier. And if you want to use it with students, just be aware that there is those mentions.
שקלתי 28 קילו, ואחותי שקלה 29. אבל ככה לאט לאט אנחנו עברנו, ואני ששקלתי 38 קילו, הלכתי לבית חולים הזה, ועבדתי בבית חולים. 8-10 שעות, קשה עבדתי, וחזרתי לעצמי ככה. אז בלילה אחת, הייתי בתורנות לילה ושמעתי שחולה אחד נורא צורח. אני רואה את החולה הזה עם שתי עיניים כחולות ובלורית בלונדינית כזאת, בחור כזה יפה. עוד לא היה לי רגש בין אישה וגבר, רק זה היה מין התעוררות כזאת. וככה התחיל הרומן, ואחר כך הוא דיבר עוד בבית חולים שהוא יוצא כבר, אנחנו נתחתן. הוא רוצה להתחתן איתי. בסדר. אז נתנו לנו 2 פתקאות לקבל בגדים, לא לקבל חליפה ולי, לחתונה. אז צריכה משהו על הראש. אז הולכת לקופת חולים ואני אומרת, אחות תראי אני מתחתנת, אולי יש לך איזושהי תחבושת גדולה, אפילו 2 חתיכות, 3 חתיכות, אני אתפור אותם, אחבר אותם ויעשה לי. היא אומרת, אני הולכת לחפש, היא הולכת והיא באה, היא אומרת, את יודעת, יש לך מזל, אני מצאתי תחבושת 1 מטר על 1 מטר, זה יהיה לך טוב, יופי. בשעה 6 הייתה החופה שלנו. אני לקחתי שושבינים הונגרים, אברהם לקח שושבינים פולנים. זה היה מסודר, סולידריות. כן, אחר כך.
ביום הזה מה
שאנחנו התחתנו.
7 זוגות.
7 זוגות התחתנו באותו היום.
אנחנו היינו ראשונים.
כבר לא היינו לבד. היה לי בעל, אז לא היינו כבר לבד. אחרי המלחמה, הרי לנו לבחורות לא היה וסת במלחמה, וגם אחרי המלחמה. אני התחתנתי, אז נכנסתי להיריון, לא ידעתי אפילו שאני בהיריון. עוד לא היה לי חזה, אז פתאום שבהיריון גדל לי החזה. הלכתי לרופא נשים, וככה סתם אני אומרת, דוקטור תראה, מה זה? הוא בודק אותי, הוא אומר, את יודעת, את בהיריון בחודש שלישי. אני קפצתי מהשולחן כמו משוגע. דוקטור, אני בהיריון? הוא אומר לי, את לא נשואה? אני כן נשואה, אבל אני לא רוצה ילד. דוקטור, תעשה לי הפלה. אני לא רוצה ילד. אני לא יכולה, לא מסוגלת לשמוע בכי של תינוק. אני שמעתי באושוויץ את התינוקות, את הצריחות. אני לא רוצה, וכל כך בכיתי.
אני לא ידעתי מזה.
הוא לא ידע מזה. אבל אני אשלם לך. תציל אותי, אני לא רוצה ילד. אם אין לך כסף, הוא אמר, אני לא עושה הפלה. באתי הביתה, לקחתי מגבת רטובה, הרטפתי מגבת, לקחתי מגהץ, הכנסתי לתקע, שמתי את המגבת על הבטן והתחלתי לגהץ. הייתי יכולה לעשות מהתינוק הזה איזשהו משהו. והרמתי ארונות והרמתי מה שיכולתי רק. וזה לא הלך בשום אופן, לא הלך בשום אופן. ושהבן שלי נולד, שהביאו לי אותו, אז שראיתי אותו נפש חיה וחשבתי איך אני רציתי להרוג אותו, איך אני אחר כך חייתי כל הזמן עם המחשבה הזאת, וכל הזמן התפללתי שאלוהים יתרום לי אותו, שלא יחולה. אצלנו נולד הבן הראשון, ובשבוע הימים היו 7 ילדים.
So, what do we get out of testimonies like this one? Yeah.
I was thinking like nuance, like we talk about how there was this huge birth rate skyrocket, right? The big baby boom. Because, you know, but if you look at it from just one point of view, baby equals woman happy. You know, that's not the full tale. They came out of this traumatic experience going into these new experiences. Not every woman is going to have the same wants in this case, especially for a new life.
Absolutely. That's a really great point. Yeah. I also think the line she said, her wartime experiences, she heard babies crying in Auschwitz. It stayed with her.
That's kind of what I was going to say. Is I think she probably, I don't think she's a horrible person at all. I think she's human, and she probably had feelings of inadequacy. You know, she doesn't want to be a bad mother. She doesn't know if she's even equipped to be a mother, let alone a good one. And so she can't fathom having a baby because she just wouldn't even know where to start. In some ways, she still feels a little not human herself. But I love the turnaround. Like, I love how once the baby was there, she just accepted him with all of her heart. I thought that was really beautiful and heartwarming.
I think I love including, and I think it's such an important thing for you to do in your classes when you're teaching about the Holocaust, or really any history. Stories are so important, those individual stories. I'm sure Stephen has said this a lot to you all. Bringing in voices, these individual voices of survivors, or whatever subject you're teaching. I think it really resonates and connects with students. But I also think one thing that we should keep in mind, especially with like clips like this one or some other testimonies that especially deal with the Holocaust, is that we want to make sure that we make it clear to our students that we're not judging, like it's not our place to judge. In Holocaust education, there's a concept known as choiceless choices. Has anyone heard of this before? Choiceless choices are basically, there's not a good or a bad, right? Like a choiceless choice would be, let's say there was a woman in a concentration camp who discovered that she was pregnant. What's her choice? She either continues to have the baby and she dies, her and the baby die, or she aborts and then she doesn't have the baby anymore. Exactly. So concepts like this, these are choiceless choices. And so it's important for us to keep this in our minds when we're studying these very dehumanizing experiences, like keep that in mind and make that clear to your students, right? Like we should not be judging, and we should not necessarily either be putting ourselves in their shoes, because we can't ever know what it was like to experience the Holocaust, but we do also want students to be developing empathy. So there's like a very fine line to walk there. Yeah.
So I was going to say, what happened to their adolescence? It stopped.
Yes.
So we have, and my mother was 16, but let's say 14, 15, 16. Then they have to endure the survival. Then all of a sudden they meet somebody, anybody, at any time.
Yeah.
I don't know. They get married. They become pregnant.
They had to grow up if they weren't already grown up.
Just like that.
Yes.
That's all.
Yes, thank you, thank you. I think for a lot of like younger children who survived the Holocaust, they were forced to grow up so quickly, but at the same time, they didn't have what we would consider, quote, a normal childhood. So this is actually also part of the reason why we see such a baby boom, is that it's not only this want and this need to build a family and have children and think about the future, but like think about being a human teenager with other boys and girls around you. What do you want to do? You want to make out, you want to have sex, right? And so like you want to have a normal experience. And so this was also part of the experience in DP camps. Like there was hypersexuality that was going on and resulted sometimes in these babies. Any other thoughts or comments about this clip? Yeah. No.
I feel like romance was very different for people in displaced persons camps and survivors that weren't in camps than it would be for people before that happened. Because, you know, you think of romance, you think of Prince Charming, grand gestures, being courted, but a lot of these people didn't have courtships, or they were very abbreviated. It's almost as if romance changed for them to something different. Like, okay, instead of this person needing to meet everything on my bucket list, I want somebody who understands me at that level. I want somebody that I know wouldn't turn me into the Nazis. Somebody that just wants a life of comfort and ease, because that's what I want. I don't need luxuries, because now basic things are luxuries. So I just want that and companionship. I feel like that's a really good point.
Yeah.
I was going to say that I find it interesting, or the climax of the clip, at the point where she said she had gone home and got the towel and got a wet towel, and I'm like holding on like, okay, well, what are you going to do? I'm thinking she's going to stuff it in herself, especially when she said she got the iron. And so I think it was interesting to see what strategies were taken in trying to have a induced abortion, because it was like, okay, well, then what, then what else did you try? And I can imagine that that was not the only thing that she tried. However, that was the one thing that she shared.
Coming over here?
Yeah, I was impressed by two things. First of all, just how new this world is to this, especially the older teen and young 20s survivors. Like, these marriage relationships were put together in a way that never would have happened before the war in their hometowns. And so everything is new. And so in many ways, the rules don't apply.
Yeah.
Later, they're going to come back to them again. But right now, at this moment, it would be like standing on the surface of a new planet.
Totally.
And then the other thing is, and this one just kind of stood out to me from the specific story, it was wonderful that the new mother loved her baby when she saw him, but I think it's really important to recognize that you can't say to an expectant mother who's uncertain about her pregnancy, you'll feel better later when the baby is born. You know, it worked in this case, but you can't assume that that was going to be the case.
Yeah, definitely.
Nikki, I had a thought. Hey, it's
Yes.
Jenna Price.
Hi,
Hi,
Jenna.
I miss you. So I had a thought before the Holocaust. In a lot of Jewish homes, the marriages or Orthodox homes, the
Yeah.
marriages were arranged.
Yeah.
Did this have any play in the DP camps, or does this show up in any testimony?
That's a really good point. Off the top, I'm sure it did. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any examples that I know of, but I'm sure it did happen because especially, I believe it was the Feldafing DP camp. It was either that one or the Furrenwald. There was a large revival of specifically Orthodox Judaism. So I imagine that in those camps where that took more of a hold, I'm sure there were arranged marriages. But that's a really interesting point, Jenna. And I miss you. Hi.
Hi.
Was there an increase in Jewish births other places in the world as a response to what happened?
That's a really good question. I don't think so. I think that the DP numbers were so large that they kind of skewed the rest of the numbers for the rest of the Jewish population of the world. But I see where you're going with that. Like that thought would make sense, right? Like even American Jews looking and seeing what happened in Europe, seeing what happened to their cousins and distant relatives, they're like, okay, time to make more babies, right? Any other questions or thoughts? Okay. Okay. So we're going to focus on the stories of 3 separate women. One, Margaret, is a survivor, and then the 2 other women are Jewish relief workers who worked in these displaced persons camps. So cultural life flourished in these DP camps. They became centers of social, religious, cultural, and political activity. I had mentioned that there were large Zionist youth movements. These became like almost like a social gathering setting for these young survivors. And I want to tell a little bit about Margaret's story because I think it's really interesting and I love this photo. So Margaret in 1945, when she was liberated, she was a survivor of Theresienstadt and Auschwitz. She made her way to the Deggendorf DP camp in occupied Germany. Residents of this displaced persons camp, they founded schools, vocational training centers, they set up synagogues, a large library, and they published 2 newspapers and organized cultural events and programming. So while there, there's Margaret. She helped establish the theater group and with other residents. So they regularly put on plays and musicals for residents of the camp just as entertainment and to give them something to do, right? To look forward to. They made their own costumes and props, and this photo, which I love on the left, is from their American-themed musical. So there's Margaret circled, and then her friend in the middle is the Statue of Liberty. So Margaret was raised, even before the Holocaust, she was a staunch Zionist. She always planned on immigrating to Israel. She never saw herself anywhere else, especially after the Holocaust. But one thing led to another, and she ended up in the United States. She did have one distant relative who lived in St. Louis, so she decided with no other family around, she might as well go live in St. Louis. So she has a quote from her testimony. She said, "It was a little strange being a Zionist all along and then deciding to come to America. But I had no relatives, I was too young, and I was tired of camp life, so I decided to come to America." So after about a year in the Deggendorf DP camp, in May 1946, she immigrated to the US with her husband at the time. Connecting to the Statue of Liberty that we see here, she said in one of her testimonies, quote, "We saw the Statue of Liberty," the real one this time, "and it was the first time I started crying. Finally, I felt safe." So this dress that we see here, the American flag one, she kept it and she carried it with her from the DP camp to the United States and she donated it, and there she is in that photo with her theater troupe. Oh, guess I don't have a photo, but she donated the dress to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. So again, another example of interesting artifacts that you can bring into the classroom. I think when a lot of people think of history and social studies, right? Facts, it's boring, it's dates, it's men and buildings and talking about war and stuff. But one thing that you take away from this is that history is a lot more than just that. So bring in diverse voices into history, really anything that you're teaching. I think it's important. So another woman I'm going to introduce you to is Greta Fischer, and she worked at the Kloster Indersdorf Children's Center in occupied Germany. So Greta's really interesting. She was born in 1910 in Czechoslovakia as the youngest of 6 children. She was trained as a kindergarten teacher in the 1920s in Czechoslovakia, and then she managed to escape Nazi-occupied Czechoslovakia in 1939, just before the war began, and she settled into London. So she worked while she was in London with Anna Freud. Is anyone familiar? Anna Freud and her father, Sigmund Freud. So working together, these two women, they really put forth new ideas about child psychology. And she worked with her in the wartime Hampstead nursery. And so after the war ended, she decided to join UNRRA as a relief worker in June 1945, and she served as the chief child welfare officer at the Kloster Indersdorf Children's Center. And this was the first international DP Children's Center. They provided care for hundreds of orphans and displaced persons, children, many of whom had survived concentration camps. So child psychology, she was really known for this innovative child-centered approach. She emphasized the importance of listening to children's stories as a form of healing. We know that in these DP camps, children, these relief workers, these social workers, were asking children to write down what they experienced, to draw what they experienced. And I think it's really fascinating that we have these sources. It gives proof, evidence of the crimes and the terrible things that they went through, but it's also a really interesting insight into children's experiences during the Holocaust and how they remembered it immediately after the Holocaust. She organized children in the Children's Center into family-like groups to foster a sense of security and belonging, right? These are two important things. And she implemented structured routines, including education and recreational activities to aid in their rehabilitation. One quote from her: "It was astonishing to see what a miracle could be worked for children orphaned by the Holocaust when the right thing was done." I like that quote a lot. Later, in 1948, she actually went to Canada with a group of these children, and she assisted in their integration into Canadian society. She then stayed in Canada and worked as a social worker in Montreal for some time before she eventually moved to Israel in 1965, where she passed away a few years later. The last one? Yeah, the last woman I'm going to introduce you to is Vida Kaufman. She worked for the JDC, so another welfare worker. Previous one worked for UNRRA, this one works for the JDC. The two organizations worked very closely with each other in displaced persons camps. I love these two photos of her working with children here. They're celebrating Hanukkah in the right side photo. So Vida was born in 1902 in Poland to a religious Jewish family, and then later, similar to the other woman's story, prior to the outbreak of World War II, she managed to escape, and then she survived the Holocaust, or survived the war in New York City. But she felt deeply connected to the plight of Polish Jews, Eastern European Jews, especially after the Holocaust. So she decided that she was going to join the Joint, and she did so in 1946. She was assigned to the Bergen-Belsen DP camp, so in the British zone in the north, and she worked to improve conditions for survivors, many of whom were physically and emotionally shattered. She helped establish medical facilities, children's homes, educational institutions. She played a really pivotal role in organizing cultural and religious events, such as the Hanukkah celebration in the photo we see here. And she participated in the establishment and development of a school system for survivors, ranging from nursery school to high schools. And she also promoted learning Hebrew language instruction. Why do you think they would encourage children in DP camps to learn Hebrew? Yeah?
Is it because they kind of had a feeling that once they sent them away from camp, they'd be like a diaspora, like they'd all go to different places, but if they all had that same Hebrew language, they'd have something that would continue to keep them in common, like a way to continue to converse?
That's interesting. What do you think? Yeah.
I think the Zionist movement had a very big effect.
Yes.
Personally speaking, from what I've heard, because I was raised with survivors, no, the Zionist movement had a very big effect on the youth there, and some Zion, even some Palestinian from people from Palestine came and taught them all sorts of agricultural skills, hoping that they will eventually
exactly
move to Palestine.
Yes.
So they felt the common language at that time would be Hebrew for them.
Exactly.
Yep.
Exactly. So they were learning Hebrew, and as you said, they were participating in different vocational training, different agricultural training, because their plan was to go to Palestine. And eventually in 1948, many of them did. One thing that we should keep in mind is, so these DP camps, they were temporary holding places, right? Like, they didn't expect to continue to spend their entire lives in these DP camps, and they didn't want to. They wanted to immigrate elsewhere. But what do we know about immigration that we even see today? It's extremely difficult. A lot of paperwork, a lot of bureaucracy, and quotas. The quotas, although they eventually were slightly raised after the Displaced Persons Act of 1948, it was still really difficult to meet the quota so you can get over there. It's a numbers game. And then also you had to have sponsorship, different medical exams. And so a lot of survivors sometimes ended up in what we might consider random places, like Australia, places that they just wanted to go anywhere. But for many, their first choice, would be Palestine, later Israel. But at the time, before the state was established in 1948, it was British mandated Palestine. So the British had a blockade, and they basically were not letting people get into Palestine very easily. They were trying to. The DPs really wanted to get there. And I connect this with Vita's story because she was actually involved with helping refugees who were on the ship. It's a very famous story called the Exodus. The Exodus in 1947, so before the State of Israel was officially established, they were a ship filled of Holocaust survivors trying to get to Palestine, and they were turned away. And so when they were turned away and sent back to Europe, Vita was one of the social workers who helped them reintegrate into German society after being turned away. One quote from her that I want to share: "For everywhere, the emphasis was on creating an atmosphere of living for the future and not in the past. I treasure no title more than which was given to me in the camp, American DP." So even though she was an American, she herself felt like a displaced person. So, yeah.
These last two women, and then others as well, that there's a sense of guilt or obligation, like they got out.
Yeah.
And that maybe compelled them.
I think that's a really good point. I think that's absolutely possible. Yeah, almost like survivor's guilt, exactly. Like they felt they had to help, they had to do something. And I think especially because we know, if anyone has seen Ken Burns' The U.S. and the Holocaust, very well done, like 3-part documentary. But right, we know that Americans, despite kind of common knowledge, or not common knowledge, but the common misconception that, oh, no one knew what was going on in Europe. No one knew about the Holocaust. Well, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Okay.
Go ahead, take 3 minutes. Take 3 minutes. All right. Everybody, we're going to go ahead and get started again. Everyone had their stretch break. We all feel good. Nikki's passing out I believe it's a lab sheet. Yeah. It's a document lab. Here, I'll get the rest of this out.
This is something that I think it might be a little too advanced, but just let's do it. So, I mean, too advanced for like certain, let's say 9 to 12, and if you only have a day or two to teach about the Holocaust, obviously you won't use this. But if you're doing an in-depth lesson about the Holocaust, a curriculum unit, perhaps this is something that you could do with your students. But I gave you all 2 documents, so these are primary sources. These are actually documents that I came across when I was doing my own dissertation research in the archives. So I got them. Oh, okay. For people who are online, these documents are in the resources tab. Under documents. Also listed under the session. So feel free to get into small groups, pairs, whatever you'd like. Read the 2 documents, and we have some discussion questions. You don't need to write anything. You can take notes. And then we can come back together in like 10, 15 minutes, and we can talk about what you guys found from these 2 documents. One of them I really hope you get a kick out of. So, this one. Yeah. So, feel free to get into groups, pairs, whatever you think you would work best.
here, so go ahead. Okay, so everyone here is going to get into small groups when you're finished. Everyone online, we're going to place them into, just put them into one large breakout group because I think it's just kind of might be easier. The small ones, I'm not sure if there's enough, just if you put them in one large breakout group to have a discussion, and then you'll just take turns. And Lee, if you could help facilitate that if you're online, I'd appreciate it.
Okay, let's have maybe 2 more minutes, and then we'll come back together as a group.
It's about the displaced camps and about all of the I don't know exactly what, like, the privacy aspect of it.
It's obviously not healthy to have that much bread in there. So, is it because they're still adjusting to the diet, like eating normal food?
And were the camps sometimes, and I know psychologically, did they like, were they previously existing on the basis or something like that?
And no vegetables. They have carrots, they have carrots, so it's not like
the trauma of that, but I guess. Okay. But we were talking about what just, to me, just the undertaking of all of this, whether it's at a displacement camp or whether it's at a place like this, the enormity, like, where do you start? The enormity of it is just almost mind-boggling. Okay, yeah, a concept.
I also like how she cares about their sanitation. Because she's saying like the German workers there aren't doing a good enough job, so we need to support them. Yeah. I was a little confused when she says only engage Jewish labor somewhere.
Person in charge of this because they're I don't mean for security, but because they're used to dealing with a large group of people.
Yeah, can we bring everyone back?
All right, everyone. Sounds like there's some great conversations happening.
All right, everybody. Bring your conversations to a close just for a second. Great conversations. Great conversations. They're so wonderful. But there is lunch to be had, so we will. I'm going to let Nikki continue on just to wrap
Thank you.
things up.
We're almost done, and I hear you have Olive Garden for lunch. It's exciting.
You have Olive Garden too?
Yeah, we have Olive
can have
Garden
my
for
share.
lunch. The collective we have Olive Garden for lunch. All right, so yeah, for the sake of time, I want to skip to document 2.
Are you okay?
Sorry, did someone online say something? No. Okay.
Oh, I'm
So document 2. What were teachers doing in 1948, just like you all are doing right now? They're learning. They're in a teacher seminar. So like I really like this document because I think it, for us as educators, right, it connects us like, oh, even after the horrors of the Holocaust, like people are still doing PDs. What did you take away from these 2 documents? Document 1 was the report about the Kloster Innersdorf, the Children's Center, and then document 2 was about the teacher training.
I could be wrong, but based on my interpretation, it seemed like where supplies and resources were lacking, intentions weren't.
Yes,
So a lot of the
I love
people that
that.
were running it, they were trying the best with what they had. They were delegating and requesting more, but they were trying. Like even in the document too, it says, yeah, we got some teachers that are like definitely not certified dog. Like they have like no pedagogical training, they have no experience, but you know what? They're here, they're enthusiastic, we're gonna make the most of it.
Absolutely.
I love that attitude. Like I still, part of me is like, oh, it's not fair, the kids deserve the best, but I still think that they were trying. The YMCA, is that our YMCA? Like,
yeah, I'm telling you,
what?
So many organizations were like involved in this effort to like provide relief and rehabilitation to survivors. Yeah. Okay.
I absolutely loved the level of just distinct honesty that was in this. Like
Yeah,
this
it's
Russian
very
guy
telling.
is heavily ineffective and is very bad at his job. But then also when we get rations from here, they're meager and we need more than that. So there was a distinct like, hey, we see what's coming in, but we also know that it needs to be more than that. And the expectation is that it will be, and we're working towards it.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of hope, I think, that was
Definitely.
within there.
Definitely. Yeah.
I thought it was interesting that this is almost 80 years ago, and they're struggling with, well, I went to school, so I know how to do schools. So you have the people who are in charge who do know how to teach,
Yes.
dealing with that influx of, man, you guys mean really well, but you don't
Yes.
know what you don't know.
Yes. Yeah. It's very true. What else?
I think, I know we're not supposed to put ourselves in their shoes, but for me, coming out of that, you would think that they would just focus on survival and getting each other healthy and reestablishing homes. The fact that education was such a high priority is very telling. It's right there on the list of their top needs with food and just survival.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know there are reports, survivors' testimony immediately after the Holocaust. As soon as, they have a place to sleep, they can have some food to eat. The thing that they're thinking about is education, especially for children, for young adults, for people in their early 20s. They missed that opportunity to go to school. That was completely taken away from them. So now they're really eager to learn.
And I found it interesting that recreation played such a huge part. Like they're worried about the totality of the child.
Yes.
Just not the educational, what they need for an education, but they want them to they want to make their lives as whole as possible and give them things to do when they're not in the classroom and be like a regular kid at recess or whatever.
Exactly. Did you guys pick up on the line about vocational training that they wanted to? Carpentry, exactly. When I was going through these documents, trying to figure out which one I wanted to share with you all, I found a follow-up document from the same woman from 2 months later. She said that the carpentry program was a failure. The boys weren't interested in it. So in case you were wondering, did not go well. So let's...
Can I ask one thing?
Of course.
Online, we were talking about the lack of sensitivity in some of the recreation choices, like the German orchestra. But the question is, as the months rolled by, when did their thankfulness turn to frustration that they were still there? And how did they deal with that?
It's a great question. It's a great question. I think very, very early on, there is resentment among German civilians and citizens for still being there, for being there at all. I think that it was a mutual feeling to make a general statement. I think the Jewish DPs wanted to get out as soon as possible. They were just waiting for the opportunity to immigrate anywhere. And I think the Germans were eager to, they were, despite everything, they also were going through a tough time, right? They had to rebuild their society. And so they were eager to move forward as well, although they had a lot to, atone for. Yeah.
I also just wanted to follow up on that. I think it's so sad how this impacted German-Jewish relations between Germans and Jews over time. I think I'm a 4G, or I don't know what I am, but I'm far removed, and I am finally I want to go to Germany. I want to visit. I want to see the culture, but I know that before me, that wasn't the sentiment. So
I have
really sad.
my dissertation advisor, Robin Judd. She's an amazing scholar. She just came out with a book, if you guys are interested. It's kind of related to this topic. It's called Between Two Worlds, and it's about Jewish women DPs who married Allied soldiers after the war. Very interesting. I bring this up because she always shared a story with me when I was doing my archival work in Germany. I'm not Jewish, but she is, and she's a 2G. She's a 3G. Her grandfather survived. And she would always share that she studied German history, so she had to go to Germany to get to the documents. And her grandfather was so upset with her, did not want her to go to Germany, didn't trust the Germans, that something terrible wouldn't happen to her while she was in the archives. So like that mistrust and that fear is still there. Yeah.
One thing that when they talked in the film about Germans having to give up their homes to Jewish displaced citizens, that reminded me of the Quartering Act in Boston before the American Revolution about Americans having to take in British soldiers. So the resentment, that's not a new thing in history.
So we're wrapping up. It's almost lunch, but I just want to skip to the very last question. How do these two documents, and really this entire presentation, everything we've talked about and everything we've learned about today, how do they help challenge this common assumption about the Holocaust ending with liberation?
I think it gives a much more clear voice. You know, if I teach this to my students, then they literally do just assume what you talked about earlier, where, okay, the doors are open, you're free, now go. And so not often do we make sure that there's time, or I, in my past teaching this, have not made sure there's time to explain, oh, no, it's not just like, exactly. So being able to give a voice to that and give something that helps to close out those questions, like throughout this institute, I think the two biggest takeaways I would have is using a personal voice. If we just teach this is what the Holocaust is, then they have like scratch your head questions. But if we give personal voices to them to relate to and connect to, then it takes one of those scratches away. And then if we give, here's what this looked like afterwards, then it helps close it out in a way that leaves curiosity and helps them understand there are 18,000 other holes to fill, but gives a whole teaching of it rather than just a bit or a piece in an incorrect way.
I love that. And mic drop. That was so good. Thank you. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
It brings back to memory for me of how the Africans were enslaved. Yes. And then Juneteenth, when they got free, they didn't know what to do. They weren't prepared to make that transition. So when we look at not just Jews, but across some of the things that are happening now in South Africa, where land was taken from the Africans, and now they got to give it back. So now there's a disconnect with the people, the white Africans versus the black. So when we look at instances, I can make a connection of the things that are happening in the world now and even then to other cultures.
That's great. I love that. Any other final thoughts?
I think it's not enough to just tell somebody that they're free. You actually have to help them be free. Because if you don't educate them, if they don't have a place to go, if society hasn't changed at all to recognize their status, then history is going to repeat itself. I think that's why education was so important, because they want to educate these kids so they can get different trainings, they can get different certifications, and they can make a life for themselves, and they can move and sort of spread their wings, I definitely see that there was still mistreatment, and there was still sort of this wariness on both sides. There was still anti-Semitism, there was still some tone-deaf approaches, but I think people were trying to do things differently, whether those were good or bad, and I'm glad that it was successful in a lot of ways.
Does anybody online have anything to add?
Yeah, I think that this really makes us see that the suffering didn't end with the Holocaust. It continued and was passed down through the generations as well.
Absolutely.
So.
Thank you, Jenna.
I was just going to say that I think it shows that organizations did step up to help these displaced people,
because a question I get from a lot of my students is like, why didn't anyone do anything? Like, why didn't the US step in? Why didn't other countries step in? So it's like having this people helping after the fact, and like there were people there to help them.
Yeah, that's a really great point. So it's lunchtime. I want to thank you all so much for being such amazing listeners, participants. It's been such a pleasure to do this presentation with you all. And I'm going to stick around for the rest of the afternoon, so thank you.
So before you give applause, real quick, because I want to give all the thanks. So the Miami Holocaust Memorial, they've paid for Nikki's time, her transport. She took the Brightline up last night just to be here today, and I'll be taking the Brightline back today to go back. Time, resources. She's also given you all this nice little USB drive. It's going to have survivor testimony and resources on it. This is for everyone in person. Just kidding. We'll send you guys stuff. I got some stuff online. I'll get some things. Everyone online, you'll get one with your books if you do the required things that need to happen. If you meet the requirements. So now if you could please give a warm round of applause for our speakers. The rest of the day will look like so. We're going to take 45 minutes for lunch. However, and the reason why is because at 12:15, I said 40 minutes. 12:15, we're going to come back because Judith Hara is going to come and share her family's story. So at 12:15, if everyone can be back online, she's going to be up here sharing her story. You can still be eating, just mindful because again, we're not using the loudspeakers because it's a problem with the sound online. But if you could just be mindful, so that way when she shares her story, you'll be able to ask questions and hear what she has to say. Other than that, everyone online, if you could be back at 12:15, I'd really appreciate it. Thank you all so very much. Olive Garden is being set up at the back. If we could start with the row over. Oh, by the way, sorry, one last thing. I'd like to thank one of our board members, Rick Shell, he's sponsoring lunch today and your breakfast. This is why we're having this wonderful feast today, and it's not just my Jimmy John's from yesterday. So it wasn't a bad. Well, having nice big trays of pasta from Olive Garden is actually pretty good too. So thank you so much, Rick, for everything and for joining us today too. We really appreciate it. We'll start with Row North. If you guys want to start on this row here and start walking down and just take turns going down in rows. Everyone online, we'll see you later. We'll stop the recording now. Thank you so much for joining us.